Formula One has a brilliant history of cheating. Sometimes teams and drivers only just push the limits. Other times, entire plans are orchestrated and executed to perfection like something out of a heist movie. Drivers have literally cut corners to snatch pole, crashed into each other to win championships, and even risked massive explosions to score points. So we're going to go over some of the most genius cheats that you probably haven't heard of. Let's go. Michael Schumacher, back in his Ferrari days, found himself in a tough spot at Monaco. He was 1.5 race wins worth of points behind Fernando Alonso. He needed to win the Monaco Grand Prix and give himself a shot at his 8th world title. On a track where it's almost impossible to overtake, Ferrari were desperate for pole position. After setting the fastest time in Q3, he bizarrely lost control of his car at 10 miles an hour at the Rascasse corner. Meanwhile, Fernando was on his hot lap and 0.2 of a second up on Michael. However, Schumi had clumsily parked across the track and triggered a yellow flag, forcing Alonso to abandon his lap. Michael. And nearly every other driver on the grid called out Schumi on his dirty tactics. The FIA agreed with them, they denied him pole position, and he was made to start from the pit lane. Even though he may have cheated, he drove an epic race on Sunday to finish 5th, while Alonso cruised to a comfortable victory and went on to claim the championship that year. But while Fernando Alonso nearly got a rough deal in this incident, he was no stranger to benefiting from controversy. In 2010, team orders were banned by the FIA, but that didn't stop Rob Smedley's infamous message to Alonso's teammate Felipe Massa. Everybody say it with me. Fernando is faster than you. But that was nothing compared to what happened in the first Singapore Grand Prix in 2008, which was much more serious and very clearly illegal. On lap 14, Renault driver Nelson Piquet Jr. mysteriously lost control of his car coming out of turn 17 and hit the wall. He was out of the race, and one by one, all the drivers began to pit under the yellow flag and safety car. The pit lane was pure chaos. Felipe Massa even drove off with his fuel hose attached to his car, as every team double stacked their cars to get a cheap pit stop. That's every team except, of course, Renault. Alonso had started 15th on the grid and had already pitted on lap 12. He came out at the back of the field in 18th place on brand new tyres. By the time regular racing resumed, he was already in 4th place, only behind cars that hadn't yet pitted, and on fresher tyres. He cruised to Renault's first podium and race win of the season. The timing of Piquet's crash couldn't have been more perfect, and that's because, as Nelson Piquet Jr. told the FIA, the whole thing was planned. He had deliberately got on the throttle way too early as he came out of the corner, all in an attempt to crash in a believable way that would be certain to bring out the all-important safety car. Now, granted, Nelson conveniently came out with a statement nearly a year after the incident, and only once Renault had dropped him for Grosjean in the middle of 2009. But what followed was a slew of allegations, cancelled sponsorships, and bans for the team managing director, Flavio Briatore, and their executive director of engineering, Pat Symonds, who now I think works for Formula One. They were forced to leave Renault, and the shockwaves from the controversy spread to Renault F1's parent company, Renault, as well. Both Flavio Briatore and Pat Symonds actually managed to fight this in court, and somehow got a pardon. Who knows how? But Flavio was no stranger to charges like this. He was the team boss at Benetton back in 1994, when our next cheat, or should I say cheats, took place. 1994 was a dark year for the sport of Formula One due to the tragic loss of the legendary Ayrton Senna and Roland Ratzenberger. The FIA had mandated that driver aids were to be outlawed for this season, which meant that teams couldn't use traction control, ABS and launch control anymore. But apparently Team Benetton didn't care much to follow these new regulations. According to several leaks, there was a secret setting in the car's onboard computer which enabled traction control and launch control. The Benetton cars were consistently getting suspiciously perfect launches at race starts. But while all of these were questionable, some of their tactics were downright dangerous. In the German Grand Prix at Hockenheim in 1994, Jos Verstappen was in the pits for a routine pit stop when nearly 6 litres of highly flammable racing fuel splashed onto him and his car, immediately catching fire. These iconic images show exactly how dangerous this was. An official investigation later revealed this was caused by a missing filter in Benetton's fuel filler hose. While every other team had used the same unmodified equipment, Benetton had figured out they could get the fuel to flow faster into the car by removing the fuel filler at the top of the hose. But despite several disqualifications from Michael Schumacher, the team never faced anything more serious than suspicion. Now, for the last 40 years, the rules have been pretty tight around cheating in races. But before this, some of the cheats were absolutely outrageous. In 1975, Vittorio Brambilla was racing for March Engineering at the Swedish Grand Prix when his engineer figured out by accident that he could trigger the light-sensitive timing equipment with the pit board. That's actually really clever. So when he could just see Robin in the distance, he waved the board in front of the timing loop, bagging him his only pole position in his Formula 1 career. Imagine the other teams just like, where did this guy come from? Funnily enough, not many were able to figure this out until the engineer joked about it in an interview in 2010. But while some cheat through sleight of hand, others take a more direct approach. Literally. In 1959, Harry Schell, the first US driver in Formula 1, decided to cut corners in his quali lap. And this wasn't a little cut, jumping over the curb. This was cutting out an entire section of the track, shaving seconds of his lap time. It was so well choreographed that he even slowed down just before the finish line, not to raise too much suspicion. Next is Hans Heyer, a German touring car driver in the late 1970s. He landed himself a one-off drive at the German GP in 1977, but failed to qualify. Determined to get his drive in, as I would be, to be fair, he managed to convince one of the officials to look the other way as he snuck his car onto the racetrack. But Hans wasn't done yet. He even overtook 2 of the cars before the race officials realised that his car was not even supposed to be racing. Rather fittingly, the car broke down 9 laps later and didn't cause an incident. Then in 1984, the first turbo era of Formula 1, the FIA had stipulated that race cars had to weigh a minimum of 540 kilograms and consume a maximum of 220 litres of fuel per race. Tyrol was the only manufacturer who still used a naturally aspirated engine. That meant their car was much lighter than 540 kilograms. So they employed a trick earlier used by teams like Brabham and Williams. But while those teams had simply started races with water meant for brake cooling, which they later dumped, Tyrol took it far further. They added nearly 64 kilograms of lead shot to the 2 gallons of water, obviously to further increase the weight they could shed on the first couple of laps. It was only when some of this lead shot leaked out into the paddock that it was spotted by the other teams. When the FIA had a look, they found that the water actually contained extra fuel. More specifically, some of it was actually the highly toxic rocket fuel called toluene. Tyrol was slammed with a number of charges and disqualified from the 1984 World Championship. But that certainly wasn't the last that we saw an F1 team draw inspiration from another. Racing Point turned up in Barcelona in 2020 with a front wing that looked like a carbon copy of Mercedes' championship winning car of 2019. They were nicknamed the Pink Mercedes and Racing Point, but the FIA weren't too amused. They fined Racing Point €400,000 and docked 15 constructors' points for copying Mercedes' brake duct design instead of designing it in-house. But really, that sounds like getting away with it and a slap on the wrist and some pocket change in fines compared to our next F1 cheat. The biggest of them all, Spygate, was one of the worst scandals in the history of the sport. And while you may have heard about this, the best bit is how they got caught. Ferrari officials were stunned when one day they received a random phone call from a photocopy shop in Woking. The caller was a man who claimed to have 800 pages of classified Ferrari design documents with him. He told the confused Italians that he had been handed over the papers by McLaren race engineer Mike Coughlin's wife, Trudy Coughlin, to make copies of it. Turns out a disgruntled Ferrari engineer, Nigel Stepney, had handed over the documents to his friend Mike in the McLaren paddock. Meanwhile, on the racetrack, McLaren and Ferrari were locked in an intense championship battle. A massive inquiry was initiated. The FIA found that no confidential information had reached anyone else inside the McLaren paddock. Ferrari assigned Stepney to a new position far away from the racetrack, and McLaren was ordered to pay a fine of $100 million. Whilst that scandal was busted by a guy in a Photoshop, this one was busted by some genius reverse engineering. In 2018, every team that wasn't running a Ferrari engine had noticed that in a straight line, the Ferraris were absolutely rapid without running a low downforce setup. Teams had long since suspected that Ferrari was somehow cheating, but no one could actually prove how. To give you a bit of context, if you don't remember, in 2019 the FIA began monitoring the rate of fuel flow into the engines of the cars. This effectively kept their power in check. These sensors would measure the rate of fuel flowing into the engine 2,200 times a second to cap it at 100 kilograms an hour, or 27.8 grams a second. And what Ferrari did to outsmart the system was genius. It gives us an idea of the kind of performance margins that engineers at this level try to deal with. Ferrari managed to program their fuel pumps to outsmart the sensors, so that when the sensor was measuring fuel flow, it was within the limit. However, in every small interval of time that the sensor wasn't measuring the fuel flow, the pump was squeezing in more fuel than legally permitted. That basically means that every 0.45 milliseconds when the sensor wasn't looking, the Ferrari engine was having a quick gulp. But the best part is yet to come. By 2019, Red Bull guessed that this was probably how Ferrari was beating the system. But instead of complaining to the FIA and having them investigate, they took it to the next level. They actually reversed engineered this and two other possible ways that Ferrari were gaining their advantage. They then presented all their systems to the FIA and asked for clarification on their legality. And that's not all. On scrutinising Charles Leclerc's car, they found that in addition to beating the fuel flow rate sensors, Ferrari were using the intercoolers to inject controlled amounts of oil into the combustion chamber to achieve additional bursts of power. Unsurprisingly, the FIA outlawed it, and Ferrari suddenly saw a massive dip in form in the championship. Their 2020 season was their worst in 40 years. The terms of the settlement between Ferrari and the FIA were kept secret, and this was disputed, of course, by the other teams. But Red Bull had outsmarted Ferrari to win that round. You should check out our other video on innovations in Formula One and what happens when F1 engineers get creative. Cheers, and I'll see you in the next video.